Ms Harris.
Good afternoon, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr Johnson. I appeal on behalf of COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, representing bereaved families in Wales. In the time I have available, I'd like to ask you some questions, again, about relations between the UK government and the Welsh government this time, and including some questions relating to the different approaches during autumn of 2020. First of all, with regards to coordination and decision-making between the four nations, I'd like to refer to a passage in the report which has been commissioned by the inquiry from, as has been mentioned, Professor Henderson. And this records that at the early stage of the pandemic, there was praise for the way that intergovernmental relations were conducted. And the report cites Mr Vaughan Gething, Health Minister for Wales, on the 10th of March 2020, saying about COBRA the following: "I don't always agree with Matt Hancock, and I certainly don't always agree with Boris Johnson. But during our COBRA calls, there has been a genuinely serious and grown-up attempt to go through issues and to reach agreement on finding the best way through." And the report then goes on to say that by September 2020, enthusiasm had waned, and it was suggested that an absence of four nations meetings had not been helpful when it came to clarity in communications. We know, of course, COBRA did not meet at all between the 10th of May and the 22nd of September 2020, and that, of course, included the period when the UK as a whole was coming out of lockdown, having gone into lockdown together. So bearing that in mind, do you agree that the type of endeavour that Mr Gething describes in the quote, that is what was needed between the four nations during the pandemic? And the second part of the question is, do you agree, in order for there to be the best chance for that type of engagement having been sustained throughout the pandemic, that there needed to have been different arrangements after May 2020 to those that were in place at that stage?
So I think the answer is yes, and then no.
And your answer no is to my suggestion that what was needed, a more predictable pattern of engagement with the Prime Minister for the devolved administrations than existed with the arrangements that were in place. Would you not agree that had there been a greater opportunity for that to happen, then that would have meant that it would have been more likely that differences could have been ironed out and there could have been a more coherent and coordinated approach forged between the four nations?
I have excellent relations and did have excellent relations with Mark Drakeford. I know he always wanted to have more meetings. And I felt that the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster was doing a good job of interacting with the DAs.
So to summarise then, Mr Johnson, you evidently felt that the arrangements that there were in place were sufficient, and you're aware, of course, that that's not a view that is shared across the devolved administrations. Point that's made in your witness statement, where you stated it's optically wrong for the UK Prime Minister to hold regular meetings with other devolved administration ministers. It can't be right, can it, that optics are a factor when deciding on what's the best setup for engagement with the other devolved governments during a pandemic? I think you'd agree with that.
So I think my considerations were the risk of pointless political friction and grandstanding.
And I'd like to ask you now to address, please, how the UK government regarded the Welsh Firebreak, which was in place from the 23rd of October to the 9th of November 2020. When the UK government was informed by the Welsh government of its plan to enter a firebreak, which is, as we know, a short lockdown, did this trigger any consideration by the UK government of alignment of England with Wales, by which both nations would move forward together to a lockdown at the same time? And that's bearing in mind that the UK government announced a national lockdown for England on the 31st of October, so only a few days later, the duration of which was 4 weeks to the 2nd of December.
I'm sure that we would have thought about seeing if we could do things together.
was there any thinking that it would be better for both nations to be acting in a coordinated way together at that point?
Right to make the point that would have been one of the advantages had we chosen to go that way, but we didn't.
Right. Now, one of the points that you've made in your witness statement is that you can understand why Wales decided on a firebreak, as the incidence in Wales was high and tiering was not working well. That's your observation. And you go on to state your view that the Welsh firebreak was not effective. You say it doesn't seem to have made a difference in Wales. So I'd like to ask you, in hindsight, what do you think would have been the right course for Wales? Is it the case that Wales should have had, in fact, a longer lockdown, or should it have had its lockdown earlier?
I think it was striking that we ended up really doing pretty much the same sort of thing.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you now about clarity in messaging. And one of the points that you made in your evidence yesterday was that clarity and unity of messaging was very important. And I'd like to ask you about the change of message from the UK government's stay at home to stay alert and how that was handled. And by way of context to the question, the change was related to the route out of lockdown. That's there. Thank you very much. So what you see there is a record compiled by the Principal Private Secretary of the First Minister for Wales, and it's in an email dated the 8th of the 5th, 2020, and it's a record of a meeting with Mr Gove on the 8th of May of the devolved administration's first ministers, and it precedes the COBRA meeting, which was on the 10th of May, which dealt with the discussion prior to the announcement of the road out of lockdown. So first of all, we have the text key points from call today with CDL and FM's Scotland and NI. And obviously the Welsh First Minister was present as well. And first bullet point, COBRA expected Sunday afternoon. A little bit further down the page, recognition that different jurisdictions may move at different pace depending on progress of disease and practicalities, for example, different school calendars, but this does not undermine Four Nations approach. Then a little further down, if we go to the bullet point, the penultimate bullet point, DAs emphasised keeping core stay-at-home message. Gove will reinforce with PM, and then CDL summarised, recognition that different pace of change reflects devolution and pace of disease. He will make sure we have time to contribute to COBRA discussions. And then finally, we'll talk to PM re-stay at home narrative. So it's obvious, of course, from that document, Mr Johnson, that the devolved administrations wanted to stay with stay-at-home message at that time. This is a record that has been compiled of the COBRA meeting on the 10th of May. This is the record compiled by the Communications Director for the Welsh Government. The issue about messaging relating to the change of message from stay at home to stay alert was raised by the First Minister for Scotland, but as we know, it was a matter where there were concerns from all the devolved administrations. And she has raised the point, and at the top of page 3, we see Prime Minister responded that nothing will appear in Scotland that will cut across the stay-at-home messages. And then in the next paragraph, we see that the UK Director of Communications, Alex Aiken, he makes some observations. I think it's fair to say that the summary of what he's saying is that he's summarising the merits of the change to stay alert. He says, stay alert encourages people to change behaviour and permissions. It has polled well. Monday into Tuesday, we will start national advertising to start to change behaviours. In the next paragraph, to the First Minister for Scotland, reiterating that they would not be moving to the stay alert message and looking for assurances that there would be no paid ads on TV or elsewhere in Scotland. This would undermine messages of the Scottish Government. Prime Minister said they will deconflict messaging as far as possible. We can move forward as 4 nations. Now is the moment to recalibrate messaging. And then further text relating to what you then went on to say. What did the UK Government do to make sure that the change of message took account of the fact that the devolved administrations were not changing their message? They wanted to stay with stay at home as the main message. And what did the plan to deconflict amount to?
You're perfectly correct that there was a divergence in the message and in the advice. It was hard to get a message that everybody could agree upon.
Yes, and a message wasn't agreed on. That's clear, isn't it? There wasn't agreement about the move to stay alert. The devolved administrations, as you've confirmed, wanted to stay with stay at home. And my question is what did the UK Government do? Did it plough ahead with stay alert, regardless, with very little adjustment? Or did it do all that could sensibly be done to make sure that there was as much clarity as possible so that people who lived in each of the 4 nations knew what applied to them? Did the UK Government do all it could sensibly do in order to bring about that outcome?
This is a perfect example of the difficulty that we had of having public health messaging that was divergent across the UK.
I mean, the UK Government itself needed to be clear, didn't it? You'd agree with that?
Thank you very much, Ms Harris.